Hi, everyone. It's Michelle from Studio City Now. And today my guest is Larry Schecter. Did I pronounce it right?
Yes.
Perfect. And you reached out to me. You wrote a book about sports fantasy teams. And I have actually joined one or two, not knowing what I was doing, but I won.
Good.
So tell me, how did you get into this? Let's start with that.
All right. Well, I've been playing fantasy sports for more than 30 years. And my book that I just recently released is about the history of fantasy sports. What happened is, for the last several years, I've looked around at the fantasy industry. And the thing is, when I started around the early 90s, and back then, most people hadn't heard of fantasy sports. You would get your report in the mail, where your team standings would show up in the mail a few days after a week ended. And since then, um, it's grown into this $25 billion a year worldwide industry. You've got millions and millions of people playing everything from fantasy football and fantasy baseball to fantasy Iditarod, fantasy cricket, um, fantasy wakeboarding. I mean, it's everything. You got news services, statistics services. You got a Sirius XM radio station dedicated 24/7 to fantasy sports. When you're watching, a football game, baseball game, they got fantasy statistics. I mean, it's just, you know, evolved into this humongous thing. And so for several years, I just looked around and wondered, how did all this happen? How did we go from ideas people had for games years ago to where we are now? And nobody has ever written a book about the history of fantasy sports. So I saw like this is something that's needed. So I decided to write it. And when I thought it was something I could knock out in like 3 or 4 months, I was completely wrong. I had no idea what I was getting into. It took me 18 months of full-time work, researching, interviewing dozens and dozens of people. And my idea originally, as I said, was write a book, The History of Fantasy Sports. What happened? Who did what when? How did it all evolve? But when I started talking to people and researching, I started hearing fascinating stories about things people had done. So I realized very early on, I could just write it telling, what happened, and I'd get the job done, but it would also come off as a very boring research paper. But by telling the stories that I was hearing of the people, what they did, what's happened is I'm telling the history, but instead of being like a boring research paper, it's come out great. People say it's fascinating, easy to read. The stories are great. So that it turned out better than I could have imagined.
Wow. 18 months. Amazing. Now, I don't know a lot about it, um, except the way I got into it.
Mhm.
My significant other at the time said, I'm in this fantasy league. Okay, you're supporting me. Oh, okay. So, how does it work? How do people play? How do they not play?
Well, your story is kind of typical. A lot of it is word of mouth. I mean, it used to be most people didn't know what it was. Now, most everybody knows what it is. If they don't play themselves, they know somebody who plays. It's something where, parents and children play. So children get introduced to it by their parents. As you said, a significant other, a lot of coworkers get involved. Um, and there's fantasy sports for all the major sports. Baseball, hockey, football, basketball, soccer, which is very popular in Europe and South America. Uh, Cricket, fantasy cricket is very popular in India. There's actually there's more than 50 million adults in the U.S. that play fantasy sports. That doesn't even count under 18, and there's a lot of under 18 that play also. In India, there are 200 million people who play fantasy cricket in India.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I didn't know that when I started researching for the book. I had never heard that. the one big cricket company in India is worth $8 billion.
Wow. And
Yeah.
it's no real playing. It's is it computer generated now or?
Well, all fantasy sports are based on the idea that you're picking real players, whether it be football, the NFL, cricket players, baseball players. It could be college football players, where you're picking real players before the season has started, and or before a game has started, and then you get various statistics based on what their performance is. And yeah, primarily, not more, computers keep track of the rosters and the statistics, and they calculate the standings. Now, it used to be, the first fantasy football league started in 1963. The first fantasy baseball league was about 1980. Back then, there was no such thing as computer. There's no internet. So people back then, they'd have to get all the standings, compute all the standings by hand. They'd have to wait for the newspaper, see the box scores in the newspaper, do it all by hand. It would take whoever did it, many hours a week to do the whole thing. Then
Mhm.
when computers came along, that kind of revolutionized it, where some of the early computer people realized, like, hey, this would be great for fantasy sports. We could do a service, compute all the statistics, make all the roster changes for everybody by computer, instead of somebody having to spend 10 hours a week doing it. And so that's when, statistics services started. And when I talk about kind of the stories of the people who did some of this, like this reminds me of one of the stories is Jim and Gloria Berger were a married couple in Pennsylvania who started one of the first statistics services. And what they had to do back then for baseball was you'd get the USA Today Tuesday edition would have all the American League statistics for the week, and the Wednesday edition had the National League statistics for the week. So Gloria would read the statistics from the USA Today. Jim would put it in a computer. They print out all the reports and get them in the mail Wednesday night. One Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child, and they did not let a little thing like going into labor stop them from doing their job. So in between contractions, Gloria would read the statistics to Jim. And then she'd be like, "Oh, wait, hold on. Another one's coming. Hold on. Okay, it passed." And she'd continue. And they got the report. They delivered their daughter, and they got the report out on time Wednesday night in the mail. And now, 37 years later, the daughter born that day plays fantasy football in a league with her dad.
Oh, that is funny because I'm trying to imagine. Oh, okay, now.
Yeah,
That's dedication.
yeah, yeah. I think their clients would have understood if they were a day late that week, but they got it out.
That is definitely funny. What is
Yeah, there's like
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
I mean, my book is full of like dozens of interesting, fascinating stories, humorous stories. A few of them are inspirational. A few of them will make you want to cry. Yeah.
Now, can you bet on the fantasy leagues also? Because I'm in
Well,
football, so.
yeah. Many many fantasy leagues have money involved. Where, say, we got maybe 12 guys for a fantasy football league. Maybe we all pitch in $50 at the beginning of the year, or $200 or whatever, and have like a
Mhm.
prize pool. So a lot of fantasy leagues do that. Some don't have very much money. Some have you know a decent amount of money involved. Um, and that's one of the big issues with the whole evolution of fantasy is the question of, is it gambling? Because you know if people are doing what I just said, that could be construed for gambling. Even maybe it's just 10 friends, just something as small as, $50 each. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but potentially it could be construed as gambling. So, there's really two chapters in the book dealing with a lot of legal issues. And one of the big legal issue was whether or not fantasy was gambling. You go way back the first ever fantasy football league in 1963 was in Oakland. They had a system where uh, you'd get points for touchdowns and some other things, and they had an amount of money. Like they had, like if you were in like a 10-cent league, it meant for every point, the other people in the league had to give you 10 cents. So they're like leagues of 10 people. So if you got a point, you'd win 90 cents, 10 cents from the other nine people. And if you were in like a 20-cent league, it was the same thing with 20 cents. Now, the thing is, they this was operated out of a restaurant in Oakland and with a lot of the patrons of the restaurant. And instead of calling it cents, they called it points because they were afraid one day the vice squad might come in and arrest them. Um, and in fact, there were a couple of cases. There was a case in Florida and a case in Austin, Texas, where the vice squad did arrest people who were had a fantasy league, accusing them of gambling. And then it had to get resolved in the courts. It actually took many years, but finally the courts, the federal government has, determined fantasy sports is not gambling. And approximately 45 of the 50 states have determined it's not gambling. And approximately 5 states are saying it is gambling.
Is California one of them?
No, no,
Okay,
no.
we're
But
pretty.
The key factor in determining if something's gambling is whether it's more luck than skill.
Mhm.
Like if you're at a roulette wheel, it's obviously all luck. Um, but fantasy, they kind of can see that some of the same people are winning on a regular basis, and that there's skill involved. It's not just luck.
You said it started in Oakland. So, and now it's all over the world. I guess the biggest country is India.
Yeah, yeah. Fantasy football started in Oakland. Fantasy baseball primarily started in Manhattan. A group of people in Manhattan. Now there were Dan Okrent is the man primarily credited for inventing fantasy baseball, and um, there's some myths about that. One of the myths is he magically came up with the idea on a plane flight from Texas, from Connecticut to Texas. That's not true. Um, there's a whole lot more to the story than that. It involves other people. It goes back 20 years prior. Um, there are also a lot of people like all over the place that kind of had their own primitive types of fantasy baseball games before he came along.
Mhm.
But what he developed in 1980 is kind of like chess compared to everybody else playing checkers. And so he developed a very sophisticated fantasy baseball game. And the other thing that was the real key to it is he is a writer, and the people in his league were all like writers or editors, like from Esquire magazine, Time magazine. They were all in the publishing or writing industry. So because of that, there were articles written about their league, which gave them a whole lot of publicity, and then lots of people started playing because they heard about this. Um, Whereas, like if he had, if he wasn't a writer, just like 12 random guys playing their league, maybe nobody would have even heard about it. But they got lots of publicity. They were on the Today Show with Bryant Gumbel. Bryant Gumbel started playing. Bantam Books asked them to write a book about it in 1984, and like 50,000 books were sold, and people read the book. They started their own league. So he's the guy who really is credited with the modern version and having it spread. And then fantasy basketball came along, fantasy soccer. There are people who are responsible for bringing things to other countries, like the guy who brought cricket to India. There's a man who brought fantasy soccer to Italy, and then that spread from there.
Here's one. Is there fantasy golf?
Right?
Is
But
there fantasy golf?
there is fantasy golf,
That's the
absolutely.
most boring game in the world.
Well, not everybody likes to watch golf, but there are people who like to watch golf and play fantasy golf. I think now you see if you play fantasy, I don't play fantasy golf, but if you play fantasy golf, it can make watching golf more interesting because, usually when you're watching golf, you're watching the people at the top of the leaderboard to see who's going to win. But if you're playing fantasy golf, you could have, two, three, four, or five guys on your team, and it kind of doesn't matter where they are in the standings. You're interested in what they're doing, even if the guy's in 30th place, it's going to help you. If he comes up to 25th place or something.
Oh, okay. See, I play golf badly,
Yeah.
but I just
Uh-huh.
can't watch it because
Right.
it's people
I
walking.
understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Now, what's the name of your book?
The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen by Larry Schecter. It's available on Amazon, most booksellers' websites, paperback and ebook. The Amazon page is where you can see all the details and lots of reviews. The reviews are fantastic.
Okay,
It's
and
it's it's a great. I just say anybody who plays fantasy sports will love it. It's a great gift for anybody who plays fantasy sports, and even people who don't have never played fantasy sports have liked it. I mean, the Midwest Book Review says fascinating from start to end, and that was from somebody who's never played fantasy sports. And I've had other people never played fantasy sports tell me they loved it.
yeah, yeah, I like that. Actually, I will buy a copy. I'll go on Amazon when we're done. And how could people reach you? Do you have Facebook, Instagram?
Yeah. Twitter, Larry Schecter. It's LarrySchechter. Facebook, I have a Larry Schecter page. I also have a History of Fantasy Sports page. Um, Instagram, I'm on Instagram. I'm not too active there, but I am on Instagram. I think if I remember correctly, I think it's L Schecter 88 on Instagram.
You now have to go
Like,
on Blue Sky.
oh well, yeah, that just I'll have to look at that. That just it's very recent development. I've been very busy. I haven't really had time to look at that, but I know I'm certainly aware of it.
Me too. I'm all over social media. And I'm like, wait. Okay, so that's The History of Fantasy Sports on Amazon. So I'm assuming thrift books, Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, but pretty much any major bookseller, it's on their website. It's not in too many stores yet, but most of them have it online.
Okay, yeah, and with Amazon, 2-day
Yeah,
shipping, great stocking stuffer.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, Amazon's the easiest. I mean, not some people don't like Amazon, but anybody who likes Amazon, it's the easiest for sure. Yeah,
Yeah. A little side note, a lot of people don't realize Amazon started as books only.
great. I know, pretty
Yeah,
amazing.
and now it's get anything on it.
Yep.
So anyway, thank you so very much. And
Okay.
yeah, I'll get this out in the next few days.
Okay.
Okay, you have a wonderful holiday this week.
Okay. You too. Thanks.
Okay, and thank you so much. Okay.
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 Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.